How old is Justin Bieber?
16.
What's Justin Bieber's eye color?
Brown.
How many songs does Justin Bieber have?
17.
What's his first song?
One Less Lonely Girl.
Does he ever skateboard?
Yeah.
Is he good at sports?
Yes.
Does he have any pets?
Yes.
What's his mommy's name?
Patty.
What's his favorite color?
Purple.
Do you ever want to meet him?
Yes.
That end.